Excellent. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. This is New York. Uh, my name is Ziad Mahirsi. I am a Senior Program Officer at the Forensic Training Institute. And I want to welcome everybody for this webinar that Stefan Schmidt, our Director for the International Forensic Program, has kindly accepted to offer. The webinar is going to be about virginity testing and the effort that the International Forensic Program has been doing around this issue. So without any further delay, I'm going to offer the floor to Stefan to start his presentation.
Thank you, Ziad. Much appreciated. And this is somewhat of a new experience to me myself, is to do a webinar. So thank you very much for logging in. To start off with, I'm the director of the International Forensics Program at Physicians for Human Rights, and have been so since 2006. And just to give you my background is actually in forensic anthropology, and I started back in the 90s in Guatemala working with Clyde Snow and the Argentinians, and we formed an anthropology team there. I've worked with the UN in many different countries, went to school at Florida State University at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice, where I got my graduate degree. And I worked as a crime scene and digital enhancement analyst at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement from 1996 until 2006, when I took on the directorship at Physicians for Human Rights. Now, this presentation is on the virginity and hymen testing, no factual, scientific, or medical basis, and that's the title of the scientific brief, forensic brief that we put out. Basically, the work started sometime in 2014, and the brief now, as a scientific brief, is published on PHR's website, but you can also find it in our documents folder under the downloadable documents that you have in your app. So to give you a little background, the forensic program has been working in Afghanistan since 2002 effectively, and since 2006 we've been actively engaged every year there, and working with the Legal Medicine Directorate, and helped establish a non-governmental organization called the Afghan Forensic Science Organization. Our main focus is obviously death investigations and looking into the mass graves of Afghanistan, but one of the things that happened in working at the Legal Medicine Directorate is that one day we were coming out, and there was a very young woman there, and it was clear that she was very intimidated. And so we started inquiring about what it was, and it turns out that virginity and hymen testing, or hymen testing for the purposes of virginity testing, is something that is quite common in Afghanistan, and we thought about how we're going to address this. And obviously this is a subject that has been addressed, especially from a human rights standpoint and from an ethical standpoint, and you can see the International Forensic Expert Group, with whom we work with on occasion, also put out a statement, which is another document that you can download there, which delves more into the ethical range. We decided that for Afghanistan, it was most important to do something where we could say that, you know, there is no scientific basis for doing such a forensic exam in order to determine something such as a sexual status, such as virginity. So we started looking into the scientific literature in order to put something together. And to give you a little background on Afghanistan itself, is that the Afghanistan Legal Medicine Directorate routinely performs these examinations in cases of where women and girls are suspected of adultery or running away from home. Even though these two things are defined under an article in its penal code, adultery or running away from home are not crimes under the penal code. Nevertheless, the examinations are undertaken by medical examiners in Afghanistan to determine whether a woman has had sexual intercourse or can be considered a virgin, thereby determining the nature of the charge in the case against the woman in question. And the problem really is that there's a overwhelming majority of women who are in the prisons in Afghanistan are accused of these so-called, what's in Afghanistan called moral crimes. Now, what also has to be said is that this culturally is something that is very important to many Afghans, meaning that, you know, the concept of virginity in and of itself, and therefore, unfortunately, this method of examining hymens for the purpose of virginity testing was introduced actually not that long ago in Afghanistan, sometime in the late 90s. And it was taken up again in the recent years, and now Afghanistan has like 6 female physicians who perform these examinations, amongst others, at the legal medicine department. So obviously, when we started working on this, it became very clear that this is used in a wide range of countries, not just Islamic states. It also happens to be used in the Middle East and Central Asia. In Indonesia, it recently was in the news because it was, they considered that virginity tests were to be compulsory as a component of a high school certificate. Even in the UK or in Europe, you've had hymen tests, who've been used in immigration cases, allegedly to establish where a spouse visa applicant is in fact married or whether the marriage is a sham. In Australia, this has happened also. In South Africa, this is also something that has been on the rise. So it's actually quite a pertinent issue. Now, from a scientific point of view, of course, we needed to look at what was, what's the component that, the assumptions that we have. So there's cultural assumptions, and one is that the bleeding hymen during the wedding night is an indication of virginity, as the hymen is broken through the penetration by the penis. An intact hymen, therefore, indicates a lack of penetration as a proof of virginity. And that examinations of the hymen are useful to establish whether a woman is a virgin or not. And the reality is that numerous medical studies undertaken in the recent decades across multiple countries have demonstrated that there really is no factual, scientific, or even a medical basis for using hymen size morphology, meaning the form of it, or its integrity, to determine whether a woman has experienced vaginal penetration, and therefore determine the state of virginity. Hymens really vary much in size, shape, flexibility, and the characteristics, and they change throughout a woman's life, all the way from young girl to older woman. Most importantly, and this is something that, again, that's outlined very much in the IFEC statement and in others concerning the ethical practice of doing so, is that these examinations can be psychologically, in some instances, really physically harmful to women and girls. So just to give a little background on the anatomy of this, is that, the hymen is really a membrane that doesn't have a lot of blood vessels, and that even if it's torn, might not bleed significantly at all. Now, what there's a general consensus around is that forced penetration and the lack of lubrication may cause lacerations to the vaginal wall, both of which are most likely to be responsible for blood-stained bed seats rather than trauma to the hymen. And bleeding is not routinely observed after a first sexual intercourse. So another thing is that the hymen can heal in a relatively short period of time. So all these things are important to take into account when you think you can examine the hymen within something as determining virginity. Now, what needs to be stated is that obviously hymen examinations are important within examinations of rape, but you have to remember that as such an examination is, it doesn't stop just with the hymen. This is something where you look at the overall picture of what kind of trauma, psychological as well as physical, the woman's had in order to determine such a thing. So interestingly enough, and you can find the bibliography and the references to the medical articles and scientific articles that we used in our hymen brief at the end of it. And please feel free to research some of this yourself and even continue research on it. In one of the articles, it was said that 44% of 100 women that were surveyed reported no bleeding at all upon their first intercourse, and another 35% reported only slight bleeding. Another one took 487 women from different cultural backgrounds and found that 40% of the women didn't bleed on, the first time they had sex. Another one was that 63% of 41 female physician colleagues did not bleed on first intercourse at all. And in concluding, you can say that the medical literature attributes vaginal bleeding following intercourse on the wedding night to many different potential factors, including forced penetration, lack of lubrication, and infection. Now, the centerpiece that we chose for our scientific brief actually is an article that was put together based on some of these articles that I just mentioned, which was written by an Egyptian and a Saudi physician. And we did that really in order to show that, there's doctors out there in other parts of the world, in the Arab region that, have concluded pretty much the same thing. So as far as breaking the hymen, it's important, again, to understand that the hymen changes over time. So in prepubertal girls, the hymen and vagina are smaller and less elastic than in an adolescent or adult woman, and consequently trauma due to penetration is likely to be more evident and more characteristic. And again, you have to look at that also under the scope of, whether this is rape or not. In postpubertal women, the hymen, may stretch, allow vaginal penetration with minimal injuries or none at all. Only a small portion of these women will exhibit changes in the hymen that are diagnostic of penetrating trauma. What's interesting is that in a 2004 study of 36 pregnant adolescent girls, medical staff were only able to make definite findings on the hymen penetration in 2 cases, meaning that another component, of course, also is whether the doctors can actually recognize what's going on. Okay. So one study comparing hymen morphology, in adolescent girls with and without a history of consensual sexual intercourse found that those who admitted to having prior intercourse, in fact, had non-disrupted intact hymens in 52% of the cases. Another study published in 2001 found that only 19% of victims between the ages of 14 and 19 years who identified as not having had prior sexual intercourse before the alleged sexual assault had acute hymenal tears, which means that even under sexual assault conditions, the hymen doesn't necessarily tear. Another study from 1998 involved a greater range of ages of women alleging sexual assault found that only 9.1% had hymenal perforation afterwards. The hymen tends to heal naturally without evidence of injury within a matter of days, was something that came up several times throughout the literature. And even for an experienced physician, it may be extremely difficult to differentiate between healed partial hymenal tear and a natural occurring superficial notch. So overall, another factor in these hymen examinations is, quote unquote, the expertise of that particular doctor. So the conclusion is that a substantial proportion of women, regardless of prior sexual experience, will not have visible genital injuries following even forced vaginal penetration. In most cases, there is no correlation between a hymen appearance and the actual history of prior sexual intercourse. Where the integrity of the hymen has been compromised, this can be attributed to causes other than sexual intercourse, including the insertion of objects, penetrating accidental trauma, and surgical procedures. Hymen examinations, in other words, do not lead to a determination of whether the hymen or vagina was penetrated by a penis or other object, and they have no diagnostic or forensic value. And that really is the centerpiece and the conclusion of our scientific brief that we presented in Afghanistan. Aside from everything else, obviously, the hymen examinations, especially forced hymen examinations, are a form of inhuman, cruel, and degrading treatment, which are prohibited by several different bodies of law. Obviously, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, degrading treatment or punishment. So international courts in Europe and Latin America have recognized hymen examinations in actually 2 precedent-setting cases as a form of torture and rape. And this is quite important because you do hear oftentimes women rights organizations saying that, this has been considered a form of torture, and basically the cases you see here, which is one in Turkey, which was the European Court of Human Rights, held that carrying out virginity tests upon 2 young women in detention constituted severe ill treatment and breach of the prohibition on torture and inhumane and degrading treatment or punishment contained in the European Convention on Human Rights. And in a Latin American one in Peru, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights found that vaginal finger inspection of a detainee by police officers constituted rape and torture. So that's what this is based on. And this is important. Our intention really with bringing the scientific brief to Afghanistan was that we wanted to introduce the science, because effectively what had happened in Afghanistan is that for some reason it was introduced as some sort of scientific method in order to back up certain moral values in the country. And rather than for us to try to argue the moral values of a country that's, very deeply religious, and we decided, okay, science really is a language that is universal and people can understand, and that's why we put this scientific brief together. What was interesting is that with the help of the Afghan Forensic Science Organization, they've taken part in several workshops where they've presented our hymen brief and had discussions. And even though we started out with doing a scientific brief because we wanted to specifically avoid talking about religious or cultural concepts, interestingly enough, the clerics that attended the workshops, and amongst other things, these are clerics that belong to the Afghan Academy of the Sciences that they have there, all agreed that these hymen examinations shouldn't take part by the Legal Medicine Directorate. Interestingly enough, the base argument was that these hymen examinations are more damaging to society than they do any good, because women can easily get accused of this and they have to go through these types of examination, which is exactly what has happened, is that now every time there is some sort of suspicion of a moral crime, and suspicion of a moral crime, I mean something like several years ago, the first time this really hit the press in Afghanistan was when the police raided a restaurant, and a very high-class restaurant in Kabul, and the waitresses there were Russian and from Tajikistan, I think, and they had to undergo these virginity tests because they basically were accusing them of prostitution. So the idea was that they do these virginity tests in order to see whether they were prostitutes. So obviously a very horrible practice and completely non-scientific and really had nothing to do with it. But what consequently really happened is that any time the police or a prosecutor comes across something like this, or where they have the feeling that that such a test will do something, they now started routinely handing these cases over to the legal medicine department. What was really interesting is that when I, for the first time, presented this scientific brief to the legal medicine department, there were all the doctors, the medical examiners sitting around the table, amongst others, the 6 female physicians that now work at the legal medicine department. Mind you, many years back when I first came and visited them, they had no female doctors. So it's pretty clear that most likely one of the reasons why they had so many females now working there is to specifically do these examinations on women. And we had a tremendous amount of pushback from these women, and initially it went so far that I was accused of promoting prostitution in Afghanistan. We eventually had a fairly decent discourse, but the women there were really, really concerned. They really felt very vested in defending the morality of Afghanistan's daughters, as they put it, and that's something that we do have to respect. Nevertheless, the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission just recently put out a report on female detention, which was something that President Ghani had asked the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission to do, which was one of the reasons why we started on our scientific brief. And as a result, they've called into a presidential commission into life, part of which is the Afghan Forensic Science Organization that will be working on this particular issue. We really hope to be able to eventually ban this practice in Afghanistan altogether. Much of our advocacy and work is aimed at specifically that. So, to say, concluding, the examination of the hymen for purposes of determining a woman's virginity has no clinical or scientific value whatsoever. The use of such examinations within any context attempting to determine a woman's sexual status is in violation of basic medical and legal standards. So our position is that health professionals requested to perform hymen examinations for the purposes of determining a woman's virginity should refuse to do so anywhere in the world. And that is something really important, and this is not only aimed at the MENA region and Arabic countries, but also at European countries where some European doctors have actually acquiesced to such examinations on occasion. So it just should not be performed, just simply because it's not scientific, it's not reliable, meaning that you can't tell, most medical doctors really have a hard time telling any kind of changes to the hymen to begin with. And second of all, if you don't see anything, which seems to be the majority of cases, you still can't determine whether, whether a woman is a virgin or not. It's just a scientifically not a valuable examination. So that kind of concludes my presentation here, and I'm more than willing and happy to open to questions for this. I don't know, Ziad, if you want to plug back in.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Stefan, for a great presentation. I am standing up front of the camera so you guys can see me. But I would like to open the floor for questions. There is a little window where you can post questions on the GoToWebinar platform. Otherwise, you can also raise your hand if you want me to offer you the microphone if you want to ask questions. As I'm not seeing any question, maybe we could start with New York. Go ahead, Christine.
I think Zabi has a question.
So I was just wondering if you also get asked questions, well, if virginity can't be determined scientifically by examining the hymen, then how do you determine virginity? Because it strikes me that there will still be a desire to be able to determine a virgin status or not. So how do you then counter that deeper need for determining virginity if you take away one tool and say that it's not valid?
Yeah, well, I mean, first off is that, we want to make clear that the scientific community does not believe in these kinds of tests because they're scientifically just not valid. Secondly, because of the ethical reasons that that we mentioned. Now, in order to answer your question, is that obviously there are always going to be people who are going to believe because it's in some sort of examination, and in order to determine such a sexual status, because it's a very important part of whatever their world of belief is, and there's not much I can do. I mean, it's just the same as in people in the United States who don't believe in evolution because of religious conceptions. Even though you scientifically show it, that might not change. So that's certainly something that's a different issue. We really wanted to make sure that from a forensic perspective, this is not a valid nor acceptable examination. It's not scientific. It shouldn't be included as something to make legal determinations on. And that's the first step.
Go ahead, Zabi, if you want to speak. I think your microphone is on.
Hey, Ziad. Thank you.
If you can introduce yourself first and then ask the question.
This is Zabi Mazuri, the Afghanistan Program Coordinator at Physicians for Human Rights. I don't have a question, but I just wanted to add on what Stefan has been talking about the outcomes of the tests that are performed by the doctors in Afghanistan. Usually when the judiciary or the police send women to the legal medicine department or to the hospitals for the test, and the doctors and the legal medicine department write reports, and that based on those reports, which sometimes they are not very clear, women do get accused of having adultery or committing adultery, and then sentenced to prison for years in many cases.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I think Dina she's based in London, but she raised her hand. Dina, I'm gonna unmute you. You're gonna be able to use your microphone to speak. I would also love to hear from your experience in the Middle East and North Africa. If you have any experiences or suggestions or comments you want to share with the group.
Hello, hi, I'm Dina Al-Shafi from Egypt. I wanted to explain a bit about how virginity testing happens in Egypt. We have a lot of this practice happening through the police, from the police mainly, where they ask the forensic doctor to examine the woman, and they title it in a way that it's for her benefit, in order for her to prove that she is, whether she's raped or not. But also, Dr. Schmidt mentioned that you have been campaigning in Afghanistan to the government, to the forensic doctors. But here in the Arab world, I'm sure also in Afghanistan, because it's the same, almost the same culture, that they spend so much time, the girls, worrying about hymens all through their life, as soon as they reach puberty until they get married, whether it's if they had sexual intercourse or if they rode a horse or a donkey in the farm, you know, where they come from. And I also think whether you are thinking of educating the mothers, the adolescents about such cases, in order for them to learn to refuse, to say no, I don't want to do this virginity testing. As part of like the FGM campaign we have here in Egypt, that the girl can say, no, I think this is wrong, whether it happens or not, of course. Thank you.
Thanks for your comment, Dina. Yes, I'm very well aware that this is, you know, it has a huge cultural component throughout the world. To answer your question, the way we go about it is that the Afghan Forensic Science Organization, which was founded in 2011 as a result of training many different people at different institutions in Afghanistan. One of the objectives behind forming that organization was to draw in also credible academics in that particular country. Because the truth of it is that many of these academics and the members of AFSO also teach at universities. And for us, it was very important that there was a partnership with the universities. And as a matter of fact, the executive director of the Afghan Forensic Science Organization actually teaches at 2 private universities in Afghanistan, and part of his curriculum is on this. So we've started introducing this into the university system, and started, you know, an academic discussion within the student community. So that's as far as we've gone right now. I mean, the AFSO is still doing awareness raising on this issue and is conducting workshops. We haven't gotten to the point where you know, where you would have a major public campaign yet, and I think it's also too early. I really think that it's very important to shore up those doctors and those scientists in Afghanistan, and I would suggest the same thing for Egypt, you know, who can stand behind this and say, you know, this is total nonsense, and scientifically it just doesn't make any sense. And as I mentioned to you, the core of our scientific brief is really built around an article that was written by an Egyptian physician and a Saudi physician, you know, both countries where this practice is is very prolific. So, you know, my suggestion really to you is that, you know, I mean, take our scientific brief. This, you know, was written by myself and the program associate at the time, but it was reviewed by several of our physicians at PHR that work with us on these issues. So it's backed by PHR and by PHR's medical doctors that work with us. Has a lot of credibility, and I would suggest to start sharing this. And incidentally, we have it on our website in several different languages. I don't know, I think it's in Arabic also. We have it in Indonesian, we have it in Persian or Dari, and obviously in English. So feel free to use this and distribute it. And like I said, you can give your Egyptian physician credit for that. We actually tried contacting them, but it turned out to be somewhat difficult, and left it at that. But they're certainly aware that we used it.
Okay, thank you.
Hi everyone, this is Vince Icapino with PHR. Dina, it's nice to hear your voice. I just wanted to add a few things. Can you hear me on is my cell phone unmuted?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I can hear you.
No. You're gone now.
Yeah, sorry, I'll use my computer, but I do have to drive my daughter to school in a minute. Okay, so we actually did a study in Turkey some 17 years ago about the attitudes of all the forensic doctors. We surveyed 75% of all of them, and you know, I couldn't agree more with what Stefan has said, and we know this very well from our experience in Turkey. And I would encourage people who are interested in trying to change, you know, the practice and people's attitudes which are driving this. You know, to look at the Turkish experience because it's long-lived and quite successful. And you know, the hymen is of no concern to sexual assault. Whether a woman is a virgin or not is not relevant to sexual assault. It's a completely inaccurate test, especially for, you know, an estrogenized hymen. There's no value. So what are health professionals, physicians, forensic doctors doing with this? It really is a matter of aiding and abetting, you know, sort of a social practice. And unfortunately, it not only, you know, causes harm, it gives the false impression that we have something to offer. And so in changing the practice and the attitudes, I agree with Stefan that it takes a long time, that you have to make inroads into the leadership. After all, hymen examinations oftentimes, I mean, the money that's generated from them is a significant portion of the income of some of our colleagues. We know this in Central Asia, that it's a big money maker. And so, you know, condemnation is you know, by itself would not be successful. I think it's really important that the medical community internalize the unreliability of the practice and become leaders and advocates to change it amongst their experts, clinicians who are called upon, you know, in just general medical practice to do these examinations. And obviously there has to be policy that follows, that prohibits and holds people accountable. Yeah, I would encourage anyone who's interested in taking this on to seek out the experiences of people who have been working on this for a good 15 or more years. So thanks, Stefan. Really appreciate it. It's an important topic.
And another thing also is like hymenal reconstructive surgery. There's actually doctors out there reconstructing hymens to make them appear as to what people imagine a virginal hymen's supposed to look like, including things like putting in little bags of blood or something like that, just to trick people. In our research, we actually came across several articles that discussed this. One of them was actually an analysis of this from a Sharia legal standpoint. It was very interesting to look into, but in general, like Ben said, this is just something that scientists and doctors should not engage in hymen examinations for the determination of virginity at all, period.
I actually would like to go back to Dina, because Susan has an interesting question about the relationship between hymen examinations and FGM. I know Egypt is one of the countries that has a large FGM campaign, and I was wondering if Dina can also take a stab in talking a little bit in the relationship between FGM and hymen examination. Actually, Suzanne is asking if there are any hymen examinations happening at doctors' offices in order to examine whether the female has experienced FGM or not. She's also asking if, like, the FGM mutilation is also confused with a loss of virginity, because both are damaging, I would say, the hymen. It's an interesting question for countries where FGM is prevalent. And before just unmuting Dina, I want to also add to her question, saying that unlike FGM, I think the hymen examination is a practice that relies pretty much in a large part of it on doctors. We go to doctors to do a virginity test. We go to doctors to repair a hymen, which is not the case in FGM, where we rely on different types of healers and other religious leaders. So in terms of advocacy, I feel PHR and all its partners and physicians on the ground are well positioned to end this practice, unlike FGM that needs a much more a larger campaign. So I give you the floor, Tina.
Egypt has been one of the, I'm sorry, the voice sometimes cuts yet, so I'm not sure I heard every single question clearly. I'll try to answer as much as I can. But Egypt has been having a problem with FGM for many, many years, and many decades. They have been forming campaigns to stop FGM, but at some point there was no sustainability of these campaigns due to the revolution and what has been happening with Egypt recently. But the good news is they have started again these campaigns, and they are not only before the campaigns were very how do you say, they weren't widespread, but currently they are on social media. You find them on television, on the first channels of the Egyptian local TV. There are all over Facebook, Twitter about FGM, what you should do, what happens. It still happens, and for example, a few colleagues of mine, they went to a place in Cairo called Sayyida Zainab, and this area is a poor area, but it has one of the biggest mosques in Cairo. And inside there was, next to the mosque, there was a man who still does the FGM techniques and practices it. And there was a long queue with adolescent girls standing with their moms and going inside, and things like, if you want to be in the beginning of the queue, you pay an extra £50, or, you know, there's all this money-making business regarding FGM. However, and on another tone, virginity testing is also encouraged by the forensic doctors here. It's part of the culture that if there is a wedding, did she bleed on was the sheets full of blood? This is a very very old-fashioned, but it still happens in very, very poor areas in Egypt. But also, our majority are the poor and the slum areas. This is the majority of Egypt. We are around 90 million, and we still have an high illiteracy rate. So I don't know if I answered all the questions.
I think you gave a good perspective on situation in Egypt, but the question was exactly actually about when doctors examine hymens to determine if there was a virginity, I mean, to assume if the hymen was touched or untouched. If this girl was a victim already of a female genital mutilation, how those two examinations, I guess they're collapsing at some point, and the doctor has to say something. They either have to say that this young girl has been mutilated, but yet is still a virgin, or vice versa, or they cannot. How do they react usually in Egypt? If you have the answer, of course.
I don't think they really relate that much. I mean, I don't think they relate in the examination process. I think we have doctors that do hymenographies in undercover hospitals. We also have doctors who do abortions in undercover hospitals. FGM is mainly done. It's not done in a clinic anymore. It used to be done in a clinic, but now because of all this campaign, it's also undercover. But virginity testing is open. You know, it's done automatically. Also, it's not only virginity testing. They also for the boys before they go into the army, they have also they test. They do also anal testing and testicular testing, just to show if he is suitable to go through the army, the compulsory military army, which could be from 1 year to 3 years. So in Egypt, it's not really, or in our context here, it's not really related. But of course, if you do FGM, then this is the idea. If you do FGM, then you're more likely to stay a virgin, quote unquote, until you get married.
Yeah, I really think that, what needs to happen is that the doctors that conduct this, really need to be shown that what they're doing is based on bad science. It's medieval at best. I really think that, for any scientists, regardless of whether they're physicians or not, somebody who comes around and says that they can determine whether a woman is a virgin or a man is a homosexual, based on, an examination of certain parts of their body, that's absolutely ludicrous. It's unscientific. Somebody who comes along with something like that is I would have a hard time taking them seriously, and I think that and that really needs to be communicated. You really have to show the people who allege to be scientists and doctors that listen, you can't do this. This is not based on any kind of rational science.
Yeah, I think you have a strong point there, and I think that's the main strategy we're going after, especially with the release of the Hyman brief. I hope everyone was able to download the handouts. We have put 2 downloads there. The one is the Hyman brief, and the second one is the statement on virginity testing that was made by the IFEG in 2014. I hope you will be able to read them and react to them. Please feel free to reach out to Stefan. His email is on the screen. My email is also, I think you have it all because that's how you kind of signed up and received the invitations to attend this webinar. Unless there is any other question here in New York. Oh, go ahead.
Just one. Just to make sure I heard correctly, did you say that hymen testing in Afghanistan came back in the 90s after a period of occurring?
No, it was never even used before then, because we actually was an interesting conversation we had with a physician in Afghanistan who knew the former medical examiner of Afghanistan, who was medical examiner until the overthrow of Daud Khan, I think, which was in '78. And he said that medical examiner said that they never did any kind of examination like that under him or under the king, meaning that, you know, anything pre-1970s or 80s never happened. No, doctors didn't engage in this kind of practice.
And does that kind
And he told us that it took a rise in 1998, actually, when the Taliban took over Kabul. My feeling is because if you talk to these doctors who conducted, they, like I said, they strongly believe that they're actually doing something scientific. I mean, I had doctors there who claimed that they could tell, based on looking at the hymen, on whether it was a penis that penetrated or a pencil or something else. So, you know, they really believe that they're doing something scientific. And my feeling is that in 1998, probably some medical doctor in Afghanistan found something somewhere in the literature and thought, oh, this is a great idea to introduce here because it'll fulfill a need. Obviously, it went away again and wasn't really picked up until the early 2000s when it was reintroduced. I'm still looking for, you know, what particular piece of literature was used in order to further something like this. And I know that, you know, if you look in the late 1800s or even back there, there is some literature, you know, coming out of Europe that does indeed talk about some of this stuff. So it could very well be that it's, you know, just based on some very, very old texts or something like that. I'm not entirely sure.
And is that kind of political research occurred in other countries where hymen testing is conducted?
You know, I don't really know. We recently, I mean, I don't know if you were there for the you know, the phone conference we had with the Human Rights Watch researcher who did something on anal examinations in several different MENA countries, you know, for the purpose of determining male homosexuality. And she actually quoted a doctor in one of those countries who actually brought forth some book from the 1800s that, you know, that had some sort of text in regards to the morphology of, you know, I don't know, the, you know, of the anus in regards to penetration or not, something to the effect.
The last question by Mariana, and then we close.
Actually, this is a comment on this. This has been tremendously helpful. Thank you, Stefan. I'm Mariana Mullman. I'm a senior researcher at PHR. So this is about, I think the resurgence of these tests, it is similar with hymen testing and FGM, like the different sort of ups and downs. And something that that I was part of documenting in northern Iraq, in Kurdish Iraq, was the resurgence of FGM when there was sort of a clampdown on the community. And some of the things that we saw was that as the women were seen as holders of the culture and as sort of, you know, their purity became a symbol of we're keeping our culture, we're keeping our community. And so I'm wondering if there's, you know, some similar cultural, you know, the need that Stefan is talking about that was resurging could also have something to do with that. We're marking that this is our culture in a sense. And often that gets translated into an assault on women's bodies who are, you know, forced to be the carriers of that culture. So it's quite common to see that. I mean, I would be interested to see a similar study to what Human Rights Watch did on where anal exams are used officially to look at where hymen exams are used officially. Because they're even in the US, you know, Utah, where there are cultural issues that, you know, put virginity high on the agenda, there's a number of doctors who engage in virginity testing, but it's not sort of an official policy that's required by the state or in something, you know, some sort of official capacity. So it would be interesting to see where it's still used as an official sort of, this is something required to X, Y, or Z.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly believe that, that you're right, that, I mean, if you look at, the resurgence of religious concepts, it's usually people flee to that kind of thing when, when they're desperately looking for some sort of rule to chaos. And, that transcends, virginity, hymen examinations or anal examinations. I think that that's just human nature, and as part of that, obviously there was a resurgence of it. I mean, the Taliban, came in, declaring that Sharia law was going to overrule everything and was going to bring peace and quiet to Afghanistan. They still say that, and this is obviously part of it. Their identity as a culture, to them and to all Afghans, it's not just the Taliban. In honor of women is something extremely important. And to a certain degree, bringing science into it, they gleefully accept that, because then all of a sudden says, you see, we're right. The problem is that they're using bad science. So what science became in Afghanistan in regards to virginity testing was a red herring. It was just bad science, a bad habit, and that needs to be broken. And that needs to be broken in Egypt and in all other places. You can't go around saying you're a scientist when, you believe that you can actually determine such things as virginity. You just simply can't. You can't say you're a scientist and believe that the Earth is only 4,000 years old and is flat.
Well, I think you have a strong point there, Stefan, and I think that the scientific brief summarizes everything that anyone might have to make a point in favor of the hymen examination. So I think we're coming to an end. So I want to thank Stefan Schmidt for his time and for kindly offering this webinar, and thank everyone else for attending. A recording of this webinar will be available, and you will receive it shortly in your emails. This will allow also all those who registered to attend it whenever they have the time. By choosing this time, we try to accommodate Afghanistan, Australia, and everyone in Europe and the Middle East and Africa. So thank you everyone for attending, and I look forward to talking to you again in the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.